Hi, everyone. This is episode 4. I'm going to celebrate every time we do another episode because I'm really excited about that. Episodes 1 through 4 are live. Today, we're going to talk about how we worked with the manufacturer to achieve our first production run. What is that process like working with the manufacturer to get your prototype ready to actually be manufactured in thousands or hundreds of units? And we want to talk about what surprises that you might expect along the way. What is a tool, when people say terms like tool and tooling and off-tool samples, what does that mean? How long is the entire process? How long does it take for each phase within the process? How much inventory do you order? Do you need to visit your supplier? If so, when is the best time to do so? We want to talk about all that today. And we're going to start off with the first thing. After you choose your manufacturer, you've signed everything, they've given you a quote, you've accepted the quote, they have all your design files. What happens first thing, Dean, after that?
So I think most people appreciate that products are made with a bunch of tools. And so for your factory to make your product, they first need to make the tools. So part of your quote that you would have received probably months before signing a contract with a factory, it's going to cover things like the cost of the tools along with the cost of the product, minimum order sizes. Yeah. So, and those tools need to be designed. They'll share those designs with you. Hopefully you've got an engineer, or you are an engineer perhaps, and you can look for possible errors in their tools.
And then after, let's say you're happy with the tools, this is when you can green light for the manufacturer to produce what we call off-tool samples. In each round, Dean would call them, this is the T1 sample, like off-tool number 1 sample, T2, T3, T4. How many rounds of off-tool samples is reasonable, Dean? What are we trying to achieve during these runs?
So the first thing you'll see is a part that's probably not in the final color that you're looking for. So as soon as the mold is done, it gets put into a testing machine, and whatever plastic they happen to have lying around gets shot into the mold, and then you'll receive these parts as your T1 samples, which like, here, this is what you sent us. We've cut the tools. Here's what we've got. Is it what you expected? And you're going to test out how the thing kind of works, and is it the right size? So you'll measure the part. Do the measurements match what were in your drawings or in your CAD, in your prototypes? And you put the whole thing together and see if the darn thing works. There are about 3 common places, I'd say, that errors can be found in a T1 part. So you can find omissions and incorrect features created by the factory. So this is not a completely automated process. This isn't a 3D printer. Whatever comes out of your CAD comes out of the 3D printer. Whatever comes out of the CAD doesn't necessarily come out of the factory, because there's a human translation. So sometimes a hole is missing. Sometimes entire features are completely incorrect, or just not even there at all. So these are just tooling omissions and errors, and they happen. You kind of have to go and look at every single feature of your product, make sure that that feature is there and it's the correct size in the part. So when we put together the parts, the second kind of error that we commonly find are design errors. These are omissions on your part, that things you actually didn't catch in the prototypes, and they're sort of product flaws or design flaws, which is still okay, but sometimes you do get all the way into T1 samples and still find things, ergonomic issues, interaction, design for assembly issues, they still appear at that point. And the third kind of problem that appears is one that can be difficult to prevent and or determine in advance of a molding. And these are processing conditions. These are errors that take form through the process of creating the part. So sometimes the way the plastic shrinks or the way the plastic was molded can create warping in the part. It can be difficult to identify all the ways that a part can be affected by its forming process. And this goes for metal parts. This goes for every material, that the act of processing the material brings its own unknowns to the table, and those need to kind of be identified and addressed in your post-tooling process.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And for Palmpress, we had about, I think, 4 rounds of off-tool samples before we approved for production. And during this time, we sorted out a lot of things. In the last episode, we talked about how it wasn't possible to prototype the exact silicone material or silicone at all that we needed for the palm press, which silicone is a really important component. So that was still an unexplored area, completely unexplored. What is the stiffness of the material that we need? What's the behavior and experience that we'll end up seeing once it's produced? So during the sampling, that was definitely sorted out. One sample was leaky for some reason, which led us to tweaking the design to strengthen the seal. That led to a decision to adding things like line markers and more feedback mechanisms on the product for the user to use, which was a whole new discovery process. And that led, Dean, I'm sure you created 3D prototypes and that we used our prototypers in conjunction during that time, so that if there's some question that we wanted answered, that we didn't want the tooling to necessarily be changed right away on a whim, but we wanted to test something out. You know, it wasn't just the off-tool samples that we were doing during that time. You can utilize other prototyping techniques to quickly answer some questions so that you're not making such permanent changes in the tool every time you want to test something new. We also tested a couple different aesthetic finishes for the product, and there was a lot to strategize and test in each of the off-tool samples. For instance, if you had a huge budget, you can make as many changes as you want. However, we try to be as strategic as possible, and that's where the lower 5 prototypes that we created help to supplement that. And guys, this isn't even getting into packaging, creating the instruction booklets. So we're only even talking about the product right now, but you can tell during this time, like to me, I felt the pressure of doing this for the first time, having a limited budget, to get in as many changes strategically and responsibly as possible in each round, and think about what things are important to do now, what things the customer will notice, what things we can do in running changes, which is another topic. So I think this was a very heightened, you know, when we talk about prototyping, how much diligence is involved, and that it can be exhausting, but if you're willing to put in the work, you can get it right and try to do it a bit economically. I think this was a whole new level of that.
It's important for people to have a sense of like what's good enough. And when you're at the point of diminishing returns, that's just something that eventually you start to absorb as you become a product person, as to what the variations in your product are going to be during manufacturing, and getting a sense of what's acceptable, what's not, and like what only you can see because you're so darn familiar with the product, and what's practically just irrelevant and invisible to the consumer. You're just so close to the problem. So it's something that we also did in the palm press is we did a pilot run. So this is short of an MOQ. Our MOQ was in the thousands, but we had negotiated up front a small production run in order to identify some of these errors, potential errors, unknowns that can happen when a tool gets up and running and up to temperature and you're producing hundreds. Producing 10 or 20 of a product doesn't really reveal some of the problems that can appear in mass manufacturing. But a half a day's production, you can really start to see what might happen. And also it gives you a bunch of samples to start testing with, to get out into customers' hands if you have some pilot testers, some beta testers, and you can really start to identify if there are design issues or other production things that have appeared. So, for instance, one of the things that we found out is that, and this is one of our running changes. We found that the original finish of the palm press could scratch easily. So our pilot production run was done in gloss, and I'm gonna, for those of you watching the video, I'm gonna show one of what is maybe two existing glossy palm presses. And this is like from the museum. This is from our pilot production run. It's beautiful.
The Museum of Palmpress.
But we found that the shiny surface wasn't terribly durable. So we did pilot production. We made a bunch of shiny palm presses, and then as a running change, we added the texture to the product. So it sort of
Now it's a nice creamy matte, which
beautiful,
I like.
and it just stays that way for its life. So that's only beautiful and shiny because it stays inside the box.
During this whole time of the off-tool samples, we created a very important document called a quality assurance program. So how should listeners be thinking about quality assurance, quality control? It's such a huge part when you're producing in such high volume.
So we need to put in plans, quality assurance plans, to make sure that the parts that the factory are making function and meet the needs of the product. So this pilot run is very helpful by revealing potential problems that can get in the way of the function of the product. And we can build documents that identify these problems and say they're not allowed. And basically, there's industry standards for counting errors and doing production inspections. And these documents form the foundations for what your quality control inspection is going to be in order for you to accept a shipment from your factory. Because a factory does a production run and then it gets inspected for quality. But the factory needs to know what you're going to be checking. So this document is a list of things that are important to you that the factory knows you're going to be looking for in your quality control inspections. So it informs their quality assurance plan, which means we're going to make sure that during production, the parts that we make are going to meet the needs of the quality control inspection that you're going to do on shipping.
After your first production run is completed, you can bring in a third-party quality control team or person that you hire to follow your quality document and inspect the number of parts out of the entire production run, or number of products out of the entire production run, and they'll report the results back to you, and we'll see if it passes the agreed upon percentages of pass rate.
Yeah, so for anybody kind of interested in quality control or looking this up, the things we're talking about are AQLs, acceptable quality levels. You can find AQL tables, which kind of describe, depending on the lot size and whether an error or something we're inspecting is considered a minor problem, a major problem, or a critical problem. These are industry standard terms. There's definitions for each. And there are guidelines as to how many acceptable problems you can have in a lot during an FRI, or final random inspection. And you're going to find a lot of these standard terms. You don't need to memorize them or know or love them, but definitely get to know them, because you're going to have to talk about them and make business decisions around them. Because the reality is, if your factory fails your inspection, somebody needs to pay for the product that just got made. And that's going to then fall back on your contract with the factory, and also be weighed against your ability to stay in business without accepting the product that you've just ordered and have been waiting to receive, and now have found out that it's of marginal quality what do you do as a business? So
Right.
there's
So
more
important to get
there
on
than
the same
just,
page,
yeah.
agree in writing, of what the expectations are for sure. And because there's so much to manage during this time between documents, different communications, changes, all that stuff. These are some tools that I remember that we used during that time. So Slack for Dean and I chatting in real time, and then we would have weekly meetings via Skype. Um, we also had a Google Doc set up since the beginning of this project. So that didn't change when we started going into sampling and manufacturing production runs. We had Google Docs that, one folder might be quality and one folder might be packaging development and one folder might be, so on and so on. So again, keep documenting everything. We also used a checklist tool called Wunderlist. We don't use it anymore. We tried a lot of things. I think it was really helpful at the time when we had so many tasks to do. And I think spreadsheets didn't feel as dynamic, or I guess we didn't check into it as much. Communication tools, checklist tools, and then document gathering tools.
Because we're talking about physical products and physical objects, photographs in your communications. I think you need to be a little more creative about how you document things. Document with a lot of photographs of the objects, and label your photographs. And these are really the best ways of communicating with your supplier, is really visual ways and literal ways, versus trying to describe things in words. Lots of pictures, lots of arrows.
Basically, don't be lazy and just type out, a quick email verbalizing what you want to be changed. Do a bit of legwork to diagram the whole thing. Everyone who looks at it for 2 seconds will know exactly what you mean without having to go back and forth in email. Oh, when you said this, did you mean this part? So exactly like Dean said, do a bit of legwork, take some photographs, things like that.
Absolutely. Good communication skills here will go a very long way. You can't count on everybody speaking the same language. You can't, and even people, even if everybody is speaking different places use different terms for features and objects and things. So that photograph it goes a long way to make sure everybody knows they're talking about exactly the same thing.
Absolutely. And what entire time frame are we looking at here? I guess it depends on how many rounds of off-tool samples you have, but even one round, what's the cost? What's the turnaround time?
Well, again, results are going to vary by far depending on your supplier and how busy they happen to be. But in general, I think you can expect the time for any change to eat up about a month of schedule.
Yep.
Between doing a little bit of testing, documenting the change that you need made, requesting that change from the factory, negotiating the cost of the change, proving it, having the change made to the tools. Again, what we're talking about is changes to tools in order to make change to the product. So the tools get changed, the tools get sampled again, the samples get put into boxes, sent to you via DHL or USPS or some other method depending. Then they need to be tested, evaluated, redocumented again, and then the process starts over again with your supplier. So yeah,
That's fair.
there's a lot of words. You can only imagine those words take about 30 days to get through.
A month or more or less.
Or more or less, yeah.
And let's say the manufacturer is a flight away. They're not just, a car ride away, be it a few hours or many, many hours. How should the project manager visit the manufacturer? If so, and let's say they can't be there all the time, when is the best time to visit?
Well, even just before that, we talked about managing timelines and projects. If you're working with a supplier in another time zone, You can really expedite your process by being awake and online for the first 2 to 3 hours of their day, wherever they happen to be. Exchanging emails on a day after day. I'll get back to you tomorrow. Not getting back to a person till the next day because they happen to be in a different time zone, and the email say comes in the middle of the night. That's one full day for that exchange, and they may just have only said there was no attachment on your email. So you just now lost a whole day because you forgot an attachment. So just being awake for those first few hours of their day, so that you can get that email and find out, oh, I didn't put the attachment on, or quickly clarify a question so that they can, because there's quick answers and long answers. And if you can nail down those quick answers really quickly so that they can go and chase down the long answers, you can really expedite your process. So big tip, be awake during the morning hours of your supplier's day. Now, do you need to be there? Keeping that into account, just imagine if you could stay up all night or during all their entire time zone in order to answer all of their questions. Now imagine if you could actually be there and save the shipping time between samples. Every sampling is at least 2 weeks to a month. So if you're in post tooling and you're in a rush to get into production, you can take a 3-month process of sampling and back and forth, and you can turn it into 2 weeks by being on site. Two things happen. The obvious, that you can see things immediately and give feedback, make yourself understood, and answer and ensure clarity because you're right there. And instead of taking pictures, you can point at the thing. But the other thing that happens that's maybe less appreciated is the urgency that physical proximity brings to a project. When you are in the room, you get your questions answered first. You're not in line on an email. You're not trying to make a video call. You are the customer who happens to be in their face. And so your problems get addressed immediately by everybody on hand. It's an amazing thing to watch when you show up at your supplier to go through post tooling and you say, hey, I'm going to be here for a week. Amazing things will happen in that week because you just happen to be there and everybody wants to take advantage of the fact that you're there.
Right. I just want to address the question of how much inventory do I need, because we received a question where someone said, if you're new and you don't know what the demand will be yet, et cetera, but this is how we chose. The MOQ was thousands, and it was as a new venture, that was just a lot of product to imagine trying to sell. So I just went with whatever the MOQ was at that time, the lowest that I could take, knowing that we may want to make some running changes afterward. Not that the customer experience would be affected, but running changes that, because we always wanted that customer experience to be wonderful and excellent from their eyes. But in the back end, the more running changes that we did, we could improve the back end process to make our work less manual as we're inspecting and shipping every product out. So I went with just whatever the MOQ was, just because it happened to be high enough that I was like, it'll definitely take some time to sell this product. But also you could base it according to the commitment that you have. Maybe you've launched this product where you actually have commitments from retailers to purchase from you, or you have a Kickstarter campaign that you already have 4,000 backers, so you'll need 4,000 units, things like that. So you could consider that. Also consider the turnaround times between production runs, especially if you want to use that time in between to make any tweaks, so that increases the time. So you don't want to order for only what you'll need for a couple months, knowing that it may take 4 months to get the next batch of product from the next time you place your order. That's an example, but that's something where you want to think about how much you'll need over the course of a year and the flow of that, and make sure you're covering any gaps. And also the other thing is, as we get so excited when we're able to make palm press in another color. However, our MOQ applied to one color at a time. So each color came with, you had to multiply, okay, that's another MOQ for another color. So we started with only one SKU, but if it's so crucial for your product, if it's a product line, if it's apparel, whatever, to come in multiple styles, then that's something that you'll have to kind of judge how much you need of each SKU, each style, each color. That's on MOQ, or that's on how much inventory to order. So the answer is always, it depends, but those are some considerations.
I just want to add to that.
Yep.
When people are making decisions about how much product they have in inventory and how long it's going to last, timeframes for ordering, you can expect anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days for production itself to take place for a product just to get into boxes and be ready for shipping. You can be looking at 30 days of shipping if you're on the water. So we're up to 60 days now, perhaps. 14 days of last mile to get from the port to your warehouse, perhaps. And then anywhere from 15 to 30 days of just getting slotted in for production, especially if you're trying to get your production slot when everybody's trying to get product out for the holidays, let's say. So right there is, how many is that? It's 60. It's like 90, at least 90 days between placing an order and having those products.
And that's not even accounting for customs delays, which we experienced one around last holiday where, they're not exactly telling you, oh, you'll get it in 7 days. It's just like, okay, there's just a delay for whatever reason, and you'll find out when to get your product later, that sort of thing. So I like to budget a full 4 months. And
with the preface that this is for manufacturing overseas, and you're going to find similar but different working with domestic suppliers or even any North American. Just get it. You need to get a feel for that in order to have smooth logistics.
Payment terms is something that I wanted to mention. For Palmpress, how it worked was we paid a 50% deposit for the tooling as well as a 50% deposit for the purchase order, I believe before the tooling began. And maybe some things, maybe my memory is not serving me as correctly, but something like that. And then the remainder was due when it was ready to release for shipment. So the tooling deposit and the whole tooling cost is a one-time fee. Obviously, if you do any changes to it in the future, you have to pay for those changes. But in general, tooling is a one-time fee. And every purchase order you have, it's usually like 50% or whatever percentage deposit up front, and then the remainder due toward the end of the production process or before it's about to ship or after it passes quality control inspections. That is that. We talked about off-tool samples. We talked about getting to the point where you're proving it for your first production run. We talked about the quality program that you want to have in place. You want to have it well documented, agreed upon. We also talked about time frames, payment terms, how much inventory to order, and I don't have anything else to add. We made it to the production run. All right. Thank you guys so much. Episode 4 is a wrap. If you have any questions or topic ideas that you'd like us to talk about, please email me at jess@palmpress.coffee. We'll leave in the show notes some things we referred to, ways to contact us, and I hope you have a great day.